And I asked her, "How are you feeling? Are you good? Are you ready to use these skills in your classroom?" And she dropped me with, "But the reading we do with you isn't real reading." We had
Ooh.
been working together for 2 years. 2 years, and I was like, "What?"
Hi, and welcome to the Smarter Literacy Podcast from Ascend Smarter Intervention, where our mission is to simplify effective literacy instruction to make teaching literacy easier and more accessible for everyone. We are your hosts, Lindsay
And Corey. And in today's episode, we will be sharing about our journey working to overcome some of the roadblocks that so many of us face while teaching literacy so that you can get to know us a little bit better and understand our backstory a bit more. And we also want to share how we overcame so much of the overwhelm that we faced while trying to teach literacy as we got started and through the journey as a whole. So, we've got 3 goals for you for today's episode. So first, we wanted to just open up a conversation about the 4 biggest challenges we faced during our literacy journey. We also want you to know that if you've faced any of these challenges, you're not alone. Sometimes this journey can feel a little bit lonely, and so we want you to know that if you've faced any of this, you are certainly not alone in that journey. And then our final goal is to share the one thing that you can do in your instruction that should help you reduce some of the overwhelm that you may be feeling if you're feeling overwhelmed. And hey, if you're not, that's great too. We'd just love to share where we're at in our journey with you, and hopefully some of it will resonate.
Yeah, so what do you think? We should just dive right in?
Yeah.
So Corey, when you first started teaching literacy, what were some initial challenges or roadblocks that you faced?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think for me, it was especially challenging because my background is not in teaching. And so getting into the literacy space, I think one of the initial challenges that I faced was one, just knowing how do students learn really anything at all. My background was in more of the cognitive neuroscience space. So I did a lot of research. And so while I had worked on the research side of, what does a student's learning trajectory look like and done a lot of the assessments and that kind of thing, I didn't necessarily have an understanding of just teaching science as a whole, or how do you engage students, or literally anything. And so I think it was a big challenge, one, overcoming that, but also getting into literacy. I mean, I don't know about you, but there is just so much that goes into it. And so when I first started as a literacy specialist, again, coming from more of a research background and having worked as a psychometrist, which is basically just doing test administration for neuropsychologists, I knew about kids and I knew about working with kids, but nothing about literacy. And so I was fortunate enough to be sent to an Orton Gillingham training right off the bat, where I was able to learn a lot of things. But oh my gosh, after that training, I was so overwhelmed with like, what is a syllable type and what is a phonogram and what is a graphic? What are these words? Like all the vocabulary. Oh my gosh. And so the idea of sitting down with students and then having to help them progress through this process just felt really overwhelming. And I didn't want to do it wrong either,
Oh,
like I
yeah.
love these kids and I wanted them to get what they needed. And so I really felt like, okay, I need to do additional research and I need to Google all of the things. And I didn't know, where do I start? And I
Mhm.
know all these terms, but I just don't really know what to do with them. And so I think that was my biggest roadblock when I started.
Yeah, I mean, everything you just said resonated so much. I mean, so my background's a little bit different. I did start out right in education. I got a master's in literacy and got my first year teaching, but I actually started off as an English teacher, so a 7th grade English teacher. And I was happy there, but I always knew that I wanted to go back to literacy. And so finally I did. I jumped back into being a literacy specialist in a secondary school and I was ready to go, thought I was so prepared. And since I had been teaching English for a little while, my school sent me to an Orton Gillingham training. And it was like a 1-week training. You just go right in every single day for the whole day. And I left that training feeling so overwhelmed to the point where I'm just like, how do any of us read? Like, how was reading even possible? So I totally get what you're saying. And, then I was going back to my classroom and just being like, do I actually know what I'm doing? Like, I, I thought I did. I mean, I have a master's in this. Like, I thought I was really confident. I was ready. And now I'm looking at my kids. I'm like, am I good at teacher? Like, I felt overwhelmed so much that I just felt like I was drowning the whole time, and that was not a good feeling to have. So, and exactly what you said, like just all that, even just the jargon of it being like, okay, how do I do this? How do I do it? How do I make sure that my kids are getting what they need? Because you want to do a good job. Like you go into teaching and working with kids because that's what you love. So,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, for me too, it was just, all right, like I have these students that I'm going to be working with, these, groups of students or individual students. I was working as a literacy interventionist. And I didn't even necessarily know how to put a lesson plan together. So
right.
after having come out of that, I knew like these are all the things that you're supposed to teach, but I really felt like, oh, it needs to be individual for every group or every student. And so it was just chaos, I think, for me in the beginning because I was trying to build everything from scratch.
Yep.
And I just didn't have the bandwidth either
Yep.
because the day was just not long enough to be able to.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there's never enough time. And you feel like you have to do all these things at once, but also differentiate for each individual kid, let alone like groups or, a whole class. And there isn't the time. And also, when you do get the time, it's generally at the end of the day and you're already burned out. And all you can focus on is like getting food into your system and going to bed.
That was exactly, yeah. It was nights, it was weekends, it was that kind of thing. And so yeah, I mean, I think that's just a big challenge is
Mhm.
just becoming familiar with what is, the science behind evidence-based practice and, keeping up to date with it and things like that, I think are just a big challenge. And so I think, in terms of the initial challenge, I think it was really just familiarizing myself with the research and then what that was going to look like.
Yeah. So now that we've kind of talked about those initial challenges and roadblocks, what helped you to overcome those initial challenges?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And so I think, one of the biggest things that helped me was that fortunately I was given the opportunity to get access to a systematic phonics based program. And so that started to tie some of the pieces together for me a little bit more because then it was like, okay, well, now at least you have a lesson plan and you know what you're supposed to do first and what you're supposed to do next. And so I was able to start working through and following that. So at least it gave me some sense of, okay, I know what I'm doing or I'm following the book. And so because I'm doing that, I can take some of the pressure off of myself a little bit and just follow the script. And so I think that helped to overcome that first challenge for sure of the overwhelm. I could start to see, oh, I see how they were talking about, phonograms or the specific sounds. And now we're doing the flashcards where we talk about the sounds and we look at the letters. And so we can really start to think about how everything comes together from that sense. And so I think having a curriculum or having a roadmap, if you will, was helpful in knowing this is what I'm going to teach first and this is what I'm going to teach next. So having not only a lesson plan, but also a scope and sequence of this is the order in which I'm going to start teaching those things.
Yes.
How about you? Did you have a curriculum or what did you do when you first got in?
Yeah, I actually loved the use that you said there of roadmap because that is truly, I feel like, what saved me from just like losing my mind. I did same as you, kind of just in the beginning there was a basic structured curriculum that I had available to me and that I was using with my students. And again, it just gave me a place to start. It gave me a place to go. I could see how all that training that I got in Orton Gillingham like made sense. And I was able to use it with my students and I literally felt like I could breathe again. And that was the biggest step for me was being able to breathe. Just so I could move forward.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Yeah, it was such a like, oh my gosh, okay, excellent. We can move forward now. But I
Yeah.
think for me, and I don't know if you felt this way at all, but one of the things that I noticed once I had a curriculum in place was that sort of created some of its own challenges too.
Oh yeah.
So where it was like, okay, great, having a curriculum has now helped me overcome that first challenge of not knowing where to start and things like that. Started to notice, that maybe the curriculum wasn't always meeting the needs
Hmm.
of all of my students,
Oh
and
yeah.
so that started to create some some difficulty for me. So I don't know if you noticed that at all or if that was me.
100%. And that's where, like, again, even though I was breathing, I felt like for the first time, that's what it felt like. Once I started getting used to it and like I was seeing my kids, I was like, I still have some problems. And how do I address this? It wasn't a complete program. Like I didn't have all the puzzle pieces that I needed for it to work and for me to be happy and satisfied with the instruction that I was giving my students to know that they were getting the best from me. And that's something that I then started to just really struggle with.
Yeah, and I think I noticed some of that too, where I'd have groups of students and I'd be like, I feel like this is landing for some of you, but not all of you. And it's like, okay, so what do I do for like that handful of kids that it's not working for? And I just felt at a loss with that. And I felt like, okay, like we just keep going. Like we're just
Yeah.
gonna keep going through the scope and sequence, and then it's gonna click, or any number of things. But I think if I just follow the program, this will land, even though deep down I sort of knew that it wasn't landing.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think I even remember being kind of told, well, just keep going. Like it will work out eventually, and being like, okay, like I I'm just going to trust that that's true. But yeah, like you said, deep down inside, you're like, oh, I don't really know if this is true. Like I feel like I should be doing more. And especially for me, going from, a seventh grade English teacher where I had 120 kids, and like, you're teaching to a class, but this time I was working with small groups or even one-on-one. And I'm like, there is no room for error. Like I need to make sure all my kids are succeeding because I only have a few of them, and I need to really be putting my all. So that was another part where I was just like, no, something's got to change.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And I think it can just be stressful as an educator to feel like we go into this field because we want to make a difference for all the kids, and we want to, as we say, create those light bulb moments. And so when you see on the one hand that, some of the light bulbs are going on and you're like, yes, that's beautiful, that's amazing, but you see that they're not all turning on, and you're like, oh my gosh, like
Yeah.
what do I do?
Yep.
I mean, at least for me, from there, that really started to turn it into kind of more of a data conversation of like, okay, coming back to research, again, that's my background, right? Is research. I think it really came back to like, let's take a look at the data and
Yep.
let's start to analyze what's going on here. And so as we think about curricula and as we start to think about, is this working or is this not, or do I have some students that it's not working for as effectively? That was really my next step was to turn and to look at the data. And I think what I started to recognize too was that while I had some data available to me, I don't think I had the right data at that time to help guide the instruction. And so I think that became another challenge for
Yes.
me. So segueing into, what's another challenge, I would say really thinking about how the data is driving instruction, but not necessarily having the data that I needed. And so I don't know if that's something that you've seen at all, like as you started to think about your curriculum and think about how you could kind of optimize that at all. Like,
Yeah, as I mentioned before, like I kind of felt like again, I was just missing puzzle pieces. I didn't have the full picture. So it really did come down a little bit to the data. We had some standardized testing, and there was some formal testing we did. And while it wasn't bad data, it wasn't lined up with the curriculum that I currently had. The two just weren't speaking to each other, it felt like, in all the right ways. So I felt like I had all these gaps. And that's where I really struggled because I'm like, okay, well, I have this data and it's pretty generalized. And I need more specific data, I think, to really drive this instruction, to really help me with those kids, like we were talking about, who the light bulbs just weren't going off for. It was really, really important for me for those kids to see success because I did not want to let them down. So, yeah. So, how did having the data drive instruction and help solve your issue?
yeah, so I think it does. It comes back to really thinking about that data. And, at the time when we were collecting data, it was really focused on word recognition skills. So it was
Yep.
really focused on those foundational skills. And so we were able to see, what patterns do the students know and what words can they read and what words can they spell. And that was kind of the end of it. And I
Same.
think I
Yep.
think the challenge with that is while that was helpful in terms of knowing, where we're going to start the progression from a systematic phonics-based program,
Mhm.
it wasn't giving the full picture because I think what ultimately I started to realize was that some students weren't able to close the gap, or they weren't really picking up on the skills because they were struggling in other areas. So
Yes.
maybe they were struggling with vocabulary, or they were struggling with comprehension, or maybe they had all the pieces, but the fluency, the automaticity just wasn't there. And I was
Yep.
like, oh my gosh, they have all of these other pieces, but it's not quite coming together. And so just having that one piece of data
Yeah.
wasn't enough for me to see how I could really optimize that instruction. And so what we started to do is, all right, let's actually take a look at the data that we are collecting and figure out, are these assessments working? Are they giving us the answers that we're looking for or not? And so by simply adding in some additional assessments to get a better look at that language comprehension, that really helped
Yeah.
significantly in being able to say, oh, maybe some of these students aren't making growth from the systematic phonics-based program that I'm using because they actually need more support in vocabulary or comprehension, or both. They need
Yes.
all of the pieces and they need to see how it connects. And so it's not that they didn't need word recognition, it's just that they also needed that other piece, which I was just completely leaving out. So I don't know if that's if you
No, yeah, honestly, so it became a discussion. So there were 2 other secondary literacy specialists in the school I was working in, and it became a discussion between the 3 of us because we were all seeing the same thing. And exactly like you said, we were noticing, we needed almost different data to, like, kinda tell us where are our kids struggling. And as my one coworker liked to say, especially in the secondary level, our kids, they're almost like Swiss cheese, right? Like they have different gaps. Like no two pieces of Swiss cheese like looks the same. And so filling one gap for one kid isn't going to look like the same for filling the gap for the other kid. So we needed more data and extensive data to show us where are the gaps for each student. So that way we could look at what do we need to work on. And that really was a big changing point.
Yeah, for sure. And so I think it's hard too, because I also know that, in terms of a challenge within a challenge, I know there's always issue with I don't have a ton of time with my
Mm,
students and that kind of thing. And so I think while it's so important to have the correct data, we also need to make sure that we're able to do that in a way that is as efficient as possible so that we're not, using a lot of our students' time. And so really thinking about that. But I
yep.
think going back through the challenges, yeah, it started with understanding the research and understanding everything that needed to be included and like, how do I teach kids? And then it moved into like, okay, do you have a system in place? And so once I got a curriculum, I was like, okay, yes, I finally can actually take my 30 minutes that I have with my students,
Yeah.
or, the time frame that I had, and use that time effectively. Then it came to like, oh no, now I've been using this curriculum and I see it's not working. It's not working for everybody. And so I need to have the data to be able to drive that. Oh no, we don't have the right data to drive the instruction. And so as we thought
Mm.
about the data, we really did want to think about how do we make sure that we're also doing this in a way that is quick and snappy so that,
And
we're
effective. Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. And yeah, and like you said, it's always just like you find one solution, you find another problem, and you just like you're like, okay, now what? Now what?
That's exactly it. And I think, and I love data. And again, I come from a research background. And so I think it's so important to be able to look at so that you can just see, hey, what's working and what's not. And in the beginning, when I looked at that data, I think I internalized a lot of that
Mm.
what does this say about me? And so I think that's something to
Yes.
consider as well, as just leaving that out.
Oh, that teacher guilt. Yeah, where you're yes, exactly. You look at those numbers and you're like, "Oh, no, look at me. I'm failing." Yep, and you just internalize so much of it and you do. You have to let that go and just move forward.
Yes, yes. I mean, and honestly, as I think about it, and again, data is super important.
Mhm.
Really feel that deep down to my core. But I also want to be clear, it doesn't solve everything.
No. No, you wish it could. You wish, like,
Mhm.
it would just give you the magic answer, and it's like, "Alright, I just have to do this, and everything will be fine."
Yeah.
But we know
Well,
that's not true.
and I mean, and I noticed that too, because once we did start to dial in on the data a little bit more, and I started to say, okay, this kiddo needs some vocabulary work, and this kiddo needs extra reading comprehension support, and this one needs more support with phonological awareness. And I really did start to dial in on that. I felt like my instruction was so much better. And I would look at
Yes.
the data and I'd be like, amazing, beautiful. Everything is trending in the right direction. Everything looks great. But I ended up having kind of a jaw-dropping moment when one of the students that I was working with in one of my groups had beautiful data. Her data was all going in the right direction. Everything was looking good. I was getting ready to graduate her out of the intervention services. And I asked her, "How are you feeling? Are you good? Are you ready to use these skills in your classroom?" And she dropped me with, "But the reading we do with you isn't real reading." We
Ooh.
had been working together for 2 years, 2 years, and I was like, "What?" I was like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, hold on. We were talking about words. We were talking about, using a vocabulary framework for the words that we saw in our decoding practice. We were breaking words into syllables and sounds." She did not make the connection at all.
Oh.
She wasn't connecting those things, and she wasn't using it outside of our work together at all in any of her classes. And so what we saw, she came back to me a couple years later for an update, and all of her growth was gone. Like, she was not in the average range anymore. And I think ultimately it comes down to that generalization and being
Mm,
able to apply those strategies in your classes, because otherwise you're just not getting the repetition that you need with those skills. Have
absolutely.
you seen anything
Oh
like
my
that?
gosh. Yes, I had a similar experience. So I happened to this one school year, I had a student and he was one on one with me, and I had him like period three. And he was doing so great in my class. And we were really working through all of our lessons. I could see the growth. The data was beautiful. And every other day, I would push into his English classroom, which happened to be the period after that I had him. So I remember one day we both went to his English class, and we had a great session in my classroom. And some of the questions that were being asked in class, I'm like, "Oh, great. He's going to be able to do this. We were just working on this." He had no clue, and he even raised his hand and was like, "How do I do this? What do I do?" Like, I'm just like, "Whoa, what? Like, what do you mean? Like, what do you mean you can't, like, read this? Or do you mean, like, you don't know what this is asking? Like, this is literally what we've just been working on." And it kinda, came down to a conversation where I kinda, like, had to pull him aside and be like, "What we were just working on in class, what you're doing with me, that's, like, something I want you working on in English and social studies." And he went, "Oh." He's like, "I didn't know." He's like, "I thought that was just for your class." And I was like, "Oh my god."
Oh, no.
Like, okay. So again, yeah, kind of the same thing where it's like, I just assumed that my student was taking these lessons. Again, he was doing great from what I was seeing and from what my data was telling me. And I just thought he was automatically going to do that in all of his classes. And he wasn't, because he did not make the connection. He, like your student said, it's not real reading. And so he saw it as this very individual class. And maybe it's because he's like, well, I don't bring social studies to English, and I don't bring English to music. So I don't bring, reading to anywhere else. And I'm like, no, it is everything. And so that was a big eye opener for me. And, it wasn't just that student, but like I checked in with all my students, being like, "Hey guys, you should really be practicing this, not just like when you're reading your, independent books or, the what we're doing in here. You should be doing this like social studies." And some of my kids were like, "Yeah, okay." And then some of my kids were like they were just dumbfounded, like, "What?"
Oh, I've
And I was
never
just like,
considered.
so that's when it hits you as a teacher, like, "Oh my gosh, okay." Like, I didn't realize this was gonna be a problem, but it turned out to be, like, one of the biggest problems, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I mean, and I think to me, I think that was just kind of the like, "Are you kidding?" Again, I just felt like, okay, I already overcame the challenge of not knowing what I was doing, right? So we,
yep,
we got past that. And then we got into, okay, the curriculum's not working for everyone. So let's go ahead and use our data
yep.
to drive the instruction. And then you're like, okay, great. My data's driving my instruction. And then the kids are not applying the thing that you spent multiple years working through. And
Yes,
so I think it's just kind of being aware of some of those
and it's just as, like, when
things.
you're like, "I'm a great teacher," you're finally feeling that success, you're finally feeling the wins, and then the kid just drops an anvil in your head, and you're like, "Oh, no. Okay. I gotta rethink things again."
Yeah. now we got to go back to the beginning of this process again and really think through that. But I think, and it's interesting too, and you're going to be at different parts of the
Yeah.
journey, at different parts of your career, and just, things change. And so I think realizing that some of these challenges may continue to resurface themselves at times. And maybe you haven't faced any of these just yet. And like, that's great too. That's beautiful.
Yes,
But
if you have never faced these challenges, we applaud you, and that is wonderful. That is wonderful. But if you have,
we're with you.
yes, again, you are not alone.
Yeah, we've been there. We see it.
So to keep this actionable, what do you do to get past these challenges, Corey?
Yeah, that's such a really great question, because while we can all, I think, empathize and be like, yes, I get that. I understand that, or I've been there
Yep.
before. We also want to figure out, like, what do we do to not get stuck in this trap of like, oh, I'm a great teacher. Oh, no, I'm not a great teacher. And we don't want to get stuck in that cycle.
Yep.
And so, in terms of actionable strategies, which we are all about here at
Yep.
Sun Smarter Intervention, we try to turn everything into a framework. But really what we want to do is we want to identify, where are you at in this process? So when we think about these challenges that might pop up, they're popping up at different points in your educational journey or in your literacy journey. And so we really just need to identify, where are you at? And so we've broken this down into 4 phases. And so the first phase is familiarize.
Yeah.
And so when you're first getting started, or when you're jumping into a new role, so like when you transitioned from the general education classroom into intervention and that looked different,
Yep.
or again, as research continues to come out and change, you may need to familiarize yourself, and you're in this familiarize phase. And so that's the first phase. And so you really need to think about, am I in that phase right now? Like, am I in a place where I'm in a learning space? I'm just learning these new skills. I'm going to new training. I know there's a lot of different trainings and programs out there and things like that. And you might be in the thick of that.
And even just like new curriculum, like being a teacher in the school system, I know how often curriculum changes, and without, really teacher consent, sometimes it's just kind of thrust upon you, and you have to familiarize yourself all over again. And it's tiring, but it is step one.
And that's
right?
step 1, yeah. And that's the first phase. And so if you're there, we want you to be able to identify, this is where I'm at.
Yeah.
Now, if you feel like, like, I have familiarized myself, I'm pretty clear on what this looks like, you may be in the systematize phase. And so systematize is where you really start to put those systems in place so that you have a clear lesson plan, you have a clear scope and sequence, you are addressing those skills that you know to be necessary from all of that familiarizing that you've done from the research. So really thinking about phonological awareness and phonics and vocabulary, fluency, comprehension, and really thinking about how that fits together.
Yep.
And so you might just be creating your system so that all right, when I come to work with my students, this is what I'm doing, and this is what my system looks like. This is when I progress monitor. This is when I do each of these different pieces, or this is how I pull groups together, or this is how I have routines around specific skills that I'm teaching.
And I would say in this phase, like, give yourself grace, because it can take a little while to like get that system in a good place. And, there's a learning curve every single time, or, even if you're just changing up a little something, maybe 1 year you're really just getting familiar with your system, and next year what worked and what didn't work, and you can change it up. And even the year after that, you're changing it up more. So give yourself grace if every day does not feel like a win. And if you feel like this didn't work, that's okay. That's okay. That's a learning moment.
That's what we tell our students that too. That was a learning moment. It's all good.
Yep.
It's all good.
And I will even say, I remember when I switched from the curriculum I had been using to a curriculum I knew that was going to be better, but it was going to take time for me to learn. And I even just came out and told my students, like, guys, you're just going to have to bear with me. I'm learning something new here. And they're like, no problem. We got you. Whatever you need, let us know. And I was like, thanks, guys. I really appreciate the support.
It's amazing. Kids are the best.
They are.
That's why we stay in this profession.
It is, yeah. And they honestly helped me learn the system, because I was like, you know what? I want to try it this way. Can you let's do it this way. Like, okay, let's do it. And I even asked them like, well, what do you think about that? And they would actually give me some really great feedback sometimes. Like, oh yeah, that I really liked how that worked, or I really liked how we did it this way instead of this way. It was really cool.
That's a great point. Your students can definitely help you as you're creating those systems and just invite them in. And I
Mhm.
think that's a really beautiful space to feel like, you know what? I don't have all of this figured out. And it gives them the grace too to realize if they don't have everything figured out, that they're in a safe space. So I
Exactly.
love that. I love the idea of having your students help you out with that part of the phase for sure. Once you've worked through that familiarize, that phase one, that systematize, that phase two, then you can start to move into optimize, which is that next phase, that third phase. And optimizing is where you take your systems that are working for you. And I know we've said curriculum, it doesn't have to be a curriculum, but whatever
Mhm.
system that you're using that's working for you, and you start to optimize that system so that you can start to think about how do I differentiate this to meet different student needs? How can I differentiate this so that if I need to spend a little bit more time on some of those like language comprehension skills or that kind
Mhm.
of thing, that I can incorporate that in? Basically, how do I take my framework and
Yeah.
just differentiate within that framework? So I'm not reinventing the wheel every time if I've got students who have different needs.
Yep.
I'm not creating a whole new curriculum. I'm not creating a whole new lesson plan, but I can use the system and the lesson plans that I have to start to kind of tweak and adjust.
Yeah, and when you are getting to this phase, you are starting to trust yourself more. Like this is where like I knew my students, I knew what the data was telling me, and I knew my system. And I'd be like, you know what, this student needs more phonics work. This student needs more comprehension work, or even that language comprehension piece. That I just needed to spend more time there. It didn't mean that I ignored the other pieces, but I just really focused it on whatever that student needed in that moment. And you start to know and you start to feel that rightness kind of come through.
Yep, absolutely. And so if you're in this phase, you may be at a point where you're feeling really comfortable with your data and what your data is telling you, or you might still be thinking, I have systems in place, but I want to start looking at the data a little bit more.
Yep.
And so that might be you're transitioning into that optimize phase where you're
Yeah.
really going to figure out how do I take what I have and just make it really work for me and my
Yep.
students and my situation. Because even though there's a lot of best practices and things like that, your students best,
Yes.
and again, I come from a research background. I love research. Do not get me wrong, but we're not in a research lab when we're working with our kids. And
Yeah.
so sometimes some of the things that we may have seen or heard that would work well, maybe you're just noticing that's not working for your students. And that's where when you're in this optimized phase, you're starting to recognize, how is that different from my setting and my situation, the
Yeah.
population of kids that I'm working with?
Yeah, because we know they're not cookie cutters, right? They're all different and they learn differently too. And just being able to really respond to the kid that's in front of you is important. And again, it's going to take some time to get there. But yeah, realizing like you said that our kids might look different than what the research is kind of showing, and that's okay. Like
Mhm.
it's okay to be different.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where again you'll use your data and kind of what is the data that I'm collecting and is this telling
Yes.
me what I need? And so we're not necessarily just flying all willy-nilly, but we're using our own observations. We're
Yeah.
using our data to help drive our instructions. And so that is where we are at that phase 3
Mhm.
in this journey. And then the final phase, phase 4, is where we start to get into that generalization phase, where
Yes.
we can make sure that our students know not only that we're teaching those right concepts and that we have
Mhm.
everything organized and we feel good about it, but also that they are seeing what does that look like in science? What does that look like in social studies? How do
Yep.
we have that conversation? And so that might be where you are. And I know I've talked with a lot of educators who feel like I need to go back to familiarize because my students aren't as automatic or efficient as they should be. And so I'm missing something. I'm missing a piece to the puzzle. And it's like, you know what? It may not be that you're missing a piece to the puzzle. It may be that you're just ready for the next step. You're ready to
Yeah.
get into authentic literature. Like, let's actually get into some chapter books or let's get
Yes.
into some reading that you're actually excited about, because sometimes what you'll see is that students who maybe their decoding still felt a little halted or
Mhm.
their comprehension was like, oh gosh, they're just not really getting this. They just had no interest in that particular topic.
Yeah, and we all know, like, some of the stuff that we use, like, some of the materials, we're not interested in either. We can't blame the kids, you know? Like, I've had definitely stuff in the past where I'm like, "Oh, okay, yeah. This was very handy for a fluency check, but it was not an interesting story."
So true. It's so true. And so I think just recognizing that you may be there.
Yeah.
And so if especially if things are starting to feel a little stale or stagnant, that might be where you're at, especially if you've been at this for, a while and you're feeling like, yeah, like you said,
Yeah.
I know the data, I know what this is telling me, I know what I need to do. We're, made sure that the kids are getting exactly what they need. We need to get them to that last phase, that
Yes.
generalization. And essentially what happens is if we don't get them there, all the results, all of the data, the positive growth that we've made,
Yep.
we need to be concerned about that
Yep.
because what that means is if they're not using it, they're not applying it, like I said, they're not getting the repetition that they need to
Yep.
make it a habit. It's not automatic for
And
them.
they will lose it. Yeah. Or like at least it will regress.
Yeah.
So, and we've all seen that, I think, and that's the hard part. And I don't know about you, but when I'm kind of in this stage, for me, I almost start with hooking my kids in by like really getting them interested. What are their interests?
Yes.
And then finding authentic literature pieces. It doesn't have to be just books. Like we can look at like comics too. We can look at like news stories, anything that can really get them using those literacy skills.
Topics, that they're
Yeah.
interested in. Exactly.
So,
yeah.
and then, having that conversation of like, yeah, we're also using these skills and these strategies when you're in social studies class, when you're in English class, when you're, even out with mom and dad and you're reading a menu or, anything that's like words coming their way or even like they're listening to words or taking in information, getting them to realize, oh, this is what I learned and this is why. Right.
And that's so great too, because that will also create a lot of buy-in for you. And when you get the buy-in and students want to learn,
Yep.
it will change your trajectory entirely as well. Like huge game changer.
100%.
So, the idea here is that when we can focus on one of these phases and we can realize, am I in phase 1? Familiarize. Am I in phase 2? Systematize. Am I in phase 3? Optimize. Or am I in phase 4, generalize? We can focus on what the specific things that we need to do in each of those phases are instead of trying to focus on everything.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the overwhelm comes when you're feeling like, oh, I need to keep up with all of the research and I need to constantly be retweaking my systems or learning a new curriculum and I need to be looking at data and analyzing that and I need to be, focusing on authentic literature and how do I pull that in? And we're trying to do everything at once.
Yeah.
Instead of just focusing on the one thing right now, the one place that you are in your journey and just honoring that and just saying, here's where I am right now and I'm going to focus on this.
And when I actually learned that, like, it's okay to be in like one step or one phase and just focus on that I really think is what made my teaching life way better. I could just do the one thing I need to do it right. And then when I was ready, I could move on to the next right thing. And was a game changer for me because the overwhelm, I mean, I remember that first year, even like into the second year, of that overwhelm just taking over. And I would be completely burnt out, just so much so that I would go home, I would eat food, and then basically just crash for the rest of the night because I did not have enough mental energy or physical energy to be able to do anything else. And that was affecting me not just as a teacher, but like as a person.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's hard too, because that's when you start to be like, am I not good at this? That's where you start, all those questions start to come in of like, is this supposed to be this hard?
Yeah.
And I think too, you can, again, cycle back through some of those phases and you're like, oh my gosh, we're here again. But I think just honoring that and recognizing, I know we were talking about, outside of this, we were talking about conferences and, conferences being a really beautiful thing. But keep in mind, if, for example, you've recognized that you are in an optimized phase and that you go to a conference, just make sure that you kind of hold yourself in okay, but I'm in an optimized phase. So I want to just kind of take all of this information that I'm hearing, let it wash over me. And if there's some little tidbit that I can take away that will help me optimize my instruction right now, that's where I'm going to focus so that you don't go back and start reworking all of your systems and reworking everything. Because I think that's where you start to get that burnout. And that's what we want to avoid.
Absolutely. And even on like the flip side, so like let's say you're in the familiarized stage, even if like especially if you're brand new to teaching or like me, you switched roles. And you go to a conference or a training and so much information is thrown at you at once. Remember to take a deep breath and realize you can't do all of that at once, right? You're going to take what you need and you're going to learn that, do that, and then you can move on. But don't feel like you have to do everything that everyone is saying because again, with a conference or a training, they're really talking about all these phases because their audience is everyone. Yeah,
any
everyone.
phase. Yeah.
So so you have to realize you can't be all those phases at once because it's impossible. And don't do that to yourself or your brain.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you can look forward a little bit to say like, all right, so the next part of my journey, for example, if you're in the familiarize phase, is that I'm going to be moving into systematizing. So I'm going to be thinking about how I start to create systems and things like that. So if you do go to a conference or something like that, you can try and take away information where you start to think about, okay, how am I going to start to create systems and things like that? And of course, I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll get to this in all of our future podcast episodes. But I think, again, your one takeaway for today is start to identify where you are in this process, so which phase that you're in. And if you need help identifying where you are in the process, you can download our SOAR blueprint, which will help you know which phase you're in so that you can keep coming back to that and just honoring that and reminding yourself if you start to step into overwhelm about where you are in the process and what your focus needs to be for that particular phase.
Yeah. And Corey, can you even tell our listeners where they can find our SOAR blueprint?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you are listening, we will have a link in our show notes. So definitely take a look there. You can also find it at smarterintervention.com/SOAR, SOR -blueprint.
Awesome. So yeah, so again, we're this episode was just to kind of familiarize ourselves with what we were going to be talking about, those 4 phases, and just to kind of start this conversation. But in our next episodes, we will be sharing more about what you can do in each of those phases to continue moving forward through your literacy journey so you can continue to feel effective and hopefully we help with that overwhelm, right? So you're not feeling overwhelmed or that you're a bad teacher because so many of us have been there where we're just, I mean, at one point I was like, I'm a horrible teacher.
No, and certainly you're not. You're here listening to a podcast. So most certainly you are not. You are a fabulous instructor. Whatever your background is, again, whether you are in the classroom, whether you are an interventionist, a special educator, whatever your role is, you're doing amazing work for these kids. And so again, that one thing, we had 3 goals for you, just again, so that you could know about the challenges, know that you're not alone, and the final goal being what's the one thing that you can take away. And so the one thing is just figure out which phase you're in. These are common roadblocks that we face, common challenges that we face in this space.
Yes, absolutely.
Perfect. Well, with that, we'll see you next time.
Absolutely. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Smarter Literacy Podcast. Make sure to subscribe for more strategies and insights to make delivering effective literacy instruction easy, or at least easier. And if you found this episode helpful, share it with a friend or leave a rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. It really does help others find the show, and we are beyond grateful for your support. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy teaching.